Hey folks, good morning. Welcome to our very first online lesson. Today we are going to be working through chapter 6 in your textbook, part writing in root position. I'm going to take you through all of our little bubbles over here. As soon as I'm done with this module, I am going to be posting a link to just this Prezi presentation on the assignment page. So if you need to go back through this and click through in your own time as you complete your homework assignments this week, you can totally do that. But let's get started. So first, let's review what we talked about the week before spring break. Remember what we're moving into now is this common practice part writing, where we have these four voices, soprano, alto, tenor, and bass voices that are moving by themselves in individual melodic lines, but also are sounding together to create these harmonies. So when we're analyzing these progressions and these part writing exercises, we have to think on two different levels. Embarrassing. Remind me tomorrow. I'll never do it. We have to think on two different levels. We have to think horizontally in terms of what the individual voice part is doing, because we do have some strictures on what we have to do there. And then we also have to think vertically in terms of what the harmonies are doing. So let's review our general guidelines for part writing exercises. I'm going to move through these really quickly. Remember, our goal is to have independence of all of our voices. We're going to do that by avoiding our parallel fifths and octaves. And we can avoid those parallel fifths and octaves by paying attention to when we have oblique, similar, parallel, and contrary motion. This is the example right out of your textbook, so if you need to review those, do so. So independence of voices is important, as well as spacing guidelines. Remember, we want no more than an octave between those upper voices, and the bass can kind of do whatever it needs to in order to fill out the chord structure that's required by the exercise. Here, no, we do not like this because there's more than an octave between that alto and soprano. Not good. Here, remember when we have a single note head with two stems coming out of the top and the bottom, that means that two voices on a single staff are doubling the same note. So in this case, our soprano and our bass are both performing that D. Remember, we can do that within a single staff. What we don't want to do is try to represent the alto and the tenor in that way. That gets a little hairy. Even if they are sounding the same note, you want to put the alto and the tenor kind of in their own spaces, in their own staffs. But this is a no because of the relationship between the tenor and the alto. We don't like that. That's more than an octave. Here we've got more than an octave happening between the bass and the tenor, but that's okay because the bass voice can kind of do whatever it needs to do as far as the requirements of the chord progression goes. So remember your spacing guidelines. Then also remember our guidelines for how to write a coherent and beautiful and interesting, exciting melodic line. Remember, we're going to keep all of our rhythms simple. All of our notes are going to fit into the same triad. We want an interesting contour with one high or low focal point, and we want to avoid any augmented intervals, and we want to totally avoid any leaps bigger than a seventh. I can't read. Leaps in general can, for the most part, be avoided. We want to try to stick to stepwise motion and smaller leaps of a third. Every once in a while, you may need to move something a fourth or a fifth in one of those upper voices. Our bass is going to be moving around by fourths and fifths a lot, but you do want to avoid these leaps bigger than a seventh. And then here are those examples that we looked at. This is our good example. It's got an interesting contour. Every single note fits in with the chord that is harmonizing it below. There are no awkward leaps. Here we have an uninteresting contour. We just go straight up and back down, and she's got all kinds of problems here on the bottom. We've got melody notes that are not in the chord. We've got two focal points. We've got a weird hop that's then left by a skip in the opposite direction. Let's talk about that really quickly. So if we do end up having skips and melodic lines, remember, if we have concurrent skips, they should all go in the same direction and they should all form a triad. So those are your rules if you're going to use more than one skip in a row. All in the same direction should outline a triad. Any leap bigger than a fourth should be left by step in the opposite direction. Let's take a look at what we mean here. This first example is great. It's got an interesting contour. It's got this one focal point. Look at what happens when you have this leap of a sixth from this E to this C. We've got this large leap, and then immediately the voice starts to move down in a stepwise motion. So we're filling in essentially that large gap that we created. That is fantastic. We love to see that. she's got all kinds of problems down here, and you can go through on your own time and evaluate what's wrong with her, but she's got issues. We don't even have time for her. So there's a little bit of a review of what we did before spring break. Keep those things in mind as we move into our lesson today. So now we're going to be connecting chords that are in root position. So we're going to be moving in between diatonic triads in a major or a minor key. They're all going to be in root position. So let's talk about what kinds of root movement we can have. So when we're looking at a chord progression consisting of these root position chords, there's really only 4 ways that these roots can move. They can be a second apart. Here, our first chord, our root note is this F. Our second chord, our root note is this G. So our roots are a second apart, and there are rules for how we navigate changing between those chords. They can be, how do I work this thing? They can be a third apart. So here our roots are a third apart, moving in a third. Zoom out. They can be a fourth apart, or we can hang on to the same root. You may notice that here in our repeated root section, sometimes our roots are literally repeated. Sometimes we literally have the same note in both chords, and sometimes we have that root displaced by an octave. So this brings me to my next point. You're probably thinking, well, there are way more intervals than seconds, thirds, fourths, and unison. Well, each one of these categories also includes the inverse of that interval. So for our repeated roots, we can have our unisons or our octaves count as repeated roots. We'll use the same procedure to voice those chords. Our fourth apart, you'll notice here, sometimes these examples, the roots are a fifth apart. Perfect fourths and perfect fifths are inversions of each other. So you're going to use the same rules for chords that are a fifth apart as for a fourth apart. Third apart, the inversion is, say it out loud, pretend like we're in class. Good job. The inversion of a third is a sixth. So any root that is a sixth apart, you're going to use the same rules as the chords that are a third apart in the root. And then seconds and sevenths invert onto each other. So roots that are a second apart and roots that are a seventh apart, we're going to deal with the same rules. The reason that we have these rules for different sort of root distances here, it's all in the name of avoiding those parallel fifths and octaves and those other illegal fifths and octaves. When we have a procedure as to how we move in and out of these chords, it's going to make it a whole lot easier for us to avoid those things. So let's start to talk about how we deal with these root movements. So let's first talk about how we deal with 2 different chords that have the same root, how we move between them. So for a repeated root chord progression, the roots are either going to stay the same or they're going to change by an octave. So what we're going to end up with is basically just a re-voicing of the same chord. You'll have the same harmony. You'll analyze it with the same Roman numeral. We'll just have each voice part sounding on a different note of the chord in the second chord than the first chord. So let's take a look at what that means. So if we have a 4-part texture, that means we've got that S, A, T, B, soprano, alto, tenor, bass texture going on. We've got 4 parts sounding at the same time. We've got 4 parts that need something to do, and we've got 3 notes in a triad. So both of these chords are probably going to have every note of the chord. And if you notice, we've got 3 tones of a triad and 4 voices that need something to do, which means we're going to have to double something usually. And usually if we have to double a note, we're going to have to double the root note. I'll kind of explain a little bit more what this means. But if you need to double a note, double the root note. That applies to not just these 2 repeated root chords next to each other. That applies almost at all times. The other thing that's a pretty good rule of thumb is do not double the leading tone. Here's why you don't want to double the leading tone in a chord. So our leading tone, remember, has that really strong gravity. It wants to push upward toward tonic. If you double that leading tone, you've got 2 of the same note that both want to continue in the same direction. So your choices are either to move them both up to where they want to go and create a big, fat parallel octave, which is a no-no, and will get you excommunicated from the church in the year 1592. Or you can move one up and move one down, and then you're denying that leading tone movement, and it's going to sound really, really funky. So do not double your leading tone. That's a great rule of thumb. Let's take a look at what it means when two chords have the same root. So here, both our tenor and our bass are sounding on that middle C. They're repeated. We can tell that because of the opposite stems poking out of that one little note head. And then our alto is on the E, and our soprano is on the G. So we have every note of our C major triad represented. We've got the C, the E, and the G. But what if I want to, on the next chord, make it sound a little bit different? I want to keep the same harmony, but I want to re-voice that chord, so there's a little bit of interesting movement happening. So we're going to repeat the root. We're still dealing with the same harmony, the same chord and root position, so we're going to repeat the root here in the bass. We're going to let this tenor voice jump up a third to the next note of the chord. We're going to let this E jump up a third to that G, and we're going to let the G and the soprano jump up to the C. So essentially what we've done is we've re-voiced this chord. So we just move every voice to the next chord tone. Here, we've got these roots moving down by an octave, and we've essentially done the same thing on top. We have moved every voice to a different note of the same chord. We have those repeated roots and the same sonority, the same harmony happening. Here, notice we've doubled our root note. We have two voices sounding on that C, so we've got that doubled root, third and fifth. Here we've got our bass sounding on the C, and also our soprano jumps up to grab that C, so we've got that doubling of the root there as well. I'm going to skip over 3-part texture because it's not really something that I care as much about in this class. We're going to work more on 4-part textures. So let's move on. So what do you do when your roots are separated by a fourth or a fifth? Remember, they're the same sort of strictures for roots that move by a fourth and roots that move by a fifth. So we are going to want to be really, really careful to avoid all of those illegal octaves and fifths. When we have that root movement by a fifth, that's going to really open us up to potentially make some mistakes as far as the voice leading and create some of those weird illegal fifths that are going to compromise the integrity of the individual parts. So we have 3 different ways that we can do root movement by a fourth and a fifth. Your homework is going to occasionally ask you to move between these chords and to say which method you used. So this is 1, 2, and 3, and they're also listed in your textbook. So method number 1, we're going to hold the common tone and then move stepwise. So here's a little bit more of an explanation of that. When we're moving between 2 chords that have roots that are a fourth or a fifth apart, they have the same rules. There's going to be a note that is the same in both chords, just because of the relationship of those roots and the relationships of those chords. There's going to be a common tone. There's going to be a note that sounds in both chords. What we want to do is whichever voice is sounding that note that's common between the 2 chords, we're going to let it stay on that common tone. So we're going to retain that common tone. And then our other 2 voices are going to move by step, and they're going to move in the opposite direction of the bass. So let's take a look at what that is going to look like. Here we're moving from a 5 chord, a G major chord, a 5 chord, and C major, back down to that 1 chord in C major. We've got root movement by a descending fifth. So since it's a fifth, we know we're going to have to use one of these rules on this slide. And since it's descending, we know that our stepwise parts are going to have to move upward. So let's identify that common tone. The note that's in common between our 5 chord in C and our 1 chord in C is that 5th scale degree of C. So the voice that's on the G is going to hang on to the G as we change to that 1 chord. So our alto is just going to park it on that G. So now we have to figure out what to do with our tenor and our soprano voices. And we know, because of the strictures of this particular method of moving between chords, we're going to have to move them in a stepwise motion. So we're going to move them by step. And since our bass is moving down, we're going to move them in the opposite direction. So they're going to go by step upward. So the D and the tenor steps up to the E, the B and the soprano steps up to the C. Notice from this B to the C, we've got this leading tone motion. We've got the leading tone lifting from B to C. It wouldn't have been as appropriate to jump down to the G because we'd be denying that really strong gravity of the leading tone, which is questionable at best. In this example, our bass is moving up. So we hold our common tone across, we retain that C. It's okay that this note is doubled because it is the root note of this one chord, so we love that for her. And our other two voices step down together to the next note of the chord. So that's way number one, that we can move between chords that are a fifth or a fourth apart. Our other way is that we can move in similar motion by second or third. So here we're not going to retain any common tones. We're just going to move all three of the upper voices in the opposite direction of the bass, and we're going to avoid any leaps larger than a third in any of those upper voices. So here our bass is moving up by a fourth, so we're just going to step each one of these voices. We're going to move them all in the same direction. They're all going to go in the opposite direction of the bass, so they're all going to go down to the closest available tone of the four chord. So we've got our C doubled here, our E, and our G. We have to move everything down. So when we're moving down from G, our closest available chord tone of the four chord is going to be that F. This one's going to need to jump down to the C, and then the C is going to need to jump down to the A. Same deal here, since our bass voice is descending, we're going to move everything else in similar motion upward. We're not really at risk of parallel because they're all sort of moving different intervals. We have some parallel thirds here, but that's totally allowed. Let's take a look at what's happening here. So we have the leading tone, right? B is the 7th scale degree of the C major scale collection, pitch collection. And we would expect this leading tone to push upward towards C. We don't necessarily want to do that because remember here our goal is to move in the opposite direction of the bass. So we're going to let this B jump down to this G just to keep with our method of moving between these chords. The reason that this is okay is because it's happening in an inner voice. So just to review, the alto and the tenor, we typically refer to those as our inner voices, and then the soprano and the bass, we typically refer to those as our outer voices. They're easier to hear. That's kind of just a human ear thing. We have a really easy time hearing things that are really high. We have a really easy time hearing things that are really low. Sometimes the stuff in the middle gets a little muddy and a little sonically questionable. So you can get away with denying that leading tone motion in this tenor part. It's okay because it's happening in an inner voice. So that is our similar motion by second or third. That's our second way to move between chords that are a fourth or a fifth apart in the root. Here's our last way. This is our least smooth way to connect these chords together, but it is really good if you want to move from an open structure to a closed structure, or vice versa. If you want to change the structure of your chords, that can be kind of an interesting stylistic choice, just depending on what you're going for. So what you're going to do here is you're going to find that common tone. Remember, we already decided in the first way that we do this that there is a common tone between those chords that are related by a fifth or a fourth in the root. So we're going to find that common chord and tone, and we're going to keep it. The voice that has the third of the first chord is going to jump so that it is sounding on the third of the next chord. And then the last voice is going to move by step to the closest chord tone. Typically, we're going to want to move it in the opposite direction of the bass, but it doesn't always work out that way. So let's take a look at what this looks like in context. Yeah, this is the wrong example. I apologize. Let me go. Stand by. Let's go to our textbook. Wow, this is embarrassing. So I would recommend, if you get a chance, to read through chapter 6. It's going to have all of these things laid out so that you can look at them. Okay, let's see. So here's our root position part writing with roots of fourth, fifth apart. Number 1 is our common tone and stepwise. Number 2 is our similar motion by second or third. Here we go. Tertian, leap, common tone, stepwise. So from 1 to 4 in C major, that common tone is going to be that C. We're going to find that C and we're going to move it across. We're going to just hang on to that C. The next thing we need to do is we need to find the note that's sounding on the third of our 1 chord, and we need to make sure that it jumps to the third of our 4 chord. So the third of our 1 chord is E. Remember that C, E, G in C major. And then our 4 chord is going to have that F, A, C. So the third of this 4 chord is going to be A. So we're going to need to make the voice that's on an E jump up to the A here. And it's our soprano that's doing that. We've got our soprano on an E, and it's going to jump up to an A here. The last remaining voice is our tenor. We're just going to allow our tenor to step down to this F. That is the nearest available chord tone. Same deal here. We find that G, which is our common tone between 1 and 5. We hold it across. We're going to let the E move to the B. And remember, if you're wondering why we move down instead of up, first of all, right, remember our general ranges for the voice parts. You don't really want to put that soprano part up on the high B. That would be kind of scary. And then also it would create an issue where you had more than an octave between the alto and the soprano. So moving down is our best choice there. We've retained our common tone. And then our last voice is going to step upward. Here we have the same thing. We've got that 7th scale degree. Typically our leading tone wants to push upward to C, but because we're using this method of voice leading between these two chords, we're going to start with the 3rd of this chord, which is the B, and we're going to let it jump to the 3rd of the next chord. Once again, we've held our common tone and we've moved stepwise in the other direction. So we do have 2 more to go. I am going to stop this here. This is going to be our first part of our lesson, and then we will pick back up in just a few minutes on root movement by a 3rd and a 6th.